Walking is the ultimate exercise that we need to introduce for ourselves. A lot in life is building up habits, and you see walking really fits with habits because it's very rare that we would be not able to go for our walk.
Dr. Kenneth Monaghan, lecturer and director of neuroplasticity research group, Atlantic Technical University, Sligo.
Personally, the reason why people don't go for a lot of walks is because it doesn't cost anything. And you'll say that's a silly thing to say, but in life, a lot of people sometimes need to pay. We undervalue things that are for free. So it's good for our mental health. We burn calories when we go. We strengthen our bodies. We release a little bit of extra testosterone in our bodies when we go for a walk. So, that's a rebuilding hormone that we create. When people are in their own home environments, apparently we create a little bit more testosterone in our bodies, which is that rebuilding hormone, which should enhance and help, neuroplasticity and help us to repair ourselves. We release substantially more of it because we're in that environment that we're familiar with. And I think instinctively, we know this. I know myself, if I ever am in a relation's house or visiting somebody else and I don't know where the cups and the saucers and everything are to make my breakfast in the morning, I feel very uncomfortable. But when I get back to my own house, I'm just so happy because I feel kind of can relax in it. We can enhance any treatment, be it a physiotherapy treatment or a medical treatment or a surgery or anything, by simply telling people about how the treatment is going to work and making them understand better before they get it. And that kind of primes the brain in a way that helps and uses that placebo effect. And you're still getting the same treatment. So it's not like we're withholding treatments from them. All we're doing is we're enhancing what we always did to improve the outcomes.
Bonded by Science, proudly presented by Noble Blocks.
Okay, so you've made a really interesting comment about priming, but before we go into something like priming, I want to readdress the placebo effect and also the nocebo effect, because here we're talking about you're very positive the way that you deliver this information. You say if you expect something is going to happen, you use a lot of positive anecdotes for that. But this also raises the nocebo effect. And how have you as a physio experienced the nocebo effects running in recovery?
I suppose it's the opposite. When I see the nocebo effect, or I sense the nocebo effect in people that have a negative attitude to what I tell them to do or what exercises and programs that I give them to do. I don't mean to be completely biased, and I'm generalizing when I say this, but when I give my exercise programs to women in general, I find they're completely compliant. I find if I have patients in my private clinic and I give them to women, I would bet you $1,000 that almost every one of them will do it exactly how I ask. Whereas I know from speaking to males, men, for some reason, not everybody, of course, but in general, men seem to take a different approach. They're a little bit probably less thorough, and they probably do their homework and exercises until they feel better and then they stop. Whereas women will feel better and they'll keep going with their exercises. Again, I mentioned a book a few minutes ago called The Expectation Effect, Shellie. And, that book really does discuss the idea of placebo effect, which is very positive, but also gives a fantastic number of chapters that talk about, negative things that can happen to us if we think it's going to happen. There's a fantastic chapter in that book that talks about a story about a man a number of years ago in America who was given a terminal illness diagnosis of cancer in his throat, and he was told that he was going to die within the next few months and he'd be very lucky to live till Christmas. As it turned out, he did live till Christmas and then he died afterwards. But when they did an autopsy on his body, they found that he had been misdiagnosed and had no cancer at all. He had something very minimal on his liver that should really not have been the reason that he died. And, that chapter and that experiment and that story, it's frightening and it's shocking in one way, because when you hear that, it makes you kind of realize that hundreds of years ago when tribes and groups had a medicine person and they all believed that this person had the ability to, cure conditions, or, if you did something wrong against the tribe, then he pointed a whalebone at you and said something, and that was the end of you, and you basically died afterwards. It doesn't seem so inconceivable when you read that chapter in The Expectation Effect about that nocebo effect. So, I know when patients are very positive and they come to me, and I think I run a private clinic where I work in the northwest of Ireland, and most people coming to me come, because they have to pay for that clinic. I find that most patients who come, they come with a positive mindset, because if they didn't have a positive mindset, they wouldn't come to me. And of course, the doctors have recommended that I'm, a physiotherapist, and I know what I'm doing. But sometimes when I worked years ago in the health service, in the public service, I probably came across a lot more, negative expectations and negative attitudes to, people kind of came because their doctor sent them, but maybe if they had had a choice, they wouldn't have come. So I see mostly positive things, but I think we still need to enhance that experience with what I spoke about earlier, this priming of people and making them believe that they will get a positive outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just relying on some of the really basic things that we have at our disposal, like don't forget to smile, don't forget to be grateful. A lot of people are now practicing what you would call like manifestation. So they tell themselves like these things are going to happen for them, and then we don't really have to disentangle the exact mechanisms of how and why. Like we don't really need to understand that, for example, the story that you gave about the person that died shortly after Christmas. I mean, just seeing it around us and being more open to the possibility that this might actually be a phenomenon, that's the first step. And of course, as scientists, we really like to know, like, well, what is the mechanism? Like, how does that work? And we're often the last persons to the party to believe in these phenomena because they sound so incredible. But I do think that now more and more people are starting to recognize that understanding what consciousness is truly is on a whole other realm of thinking. And I, for me as a scientist, it kind of brought back some of that magic of becoming a scientist, because it's like, wow, there's like stuff that we really just don't understand. Like the universe is massive, and there is some magic still left in the universe. And I think that's really, really powerful. And, just coming back to the power of thought.
We very much, I suppose, we, as scientists, we're very interested in objective information that backs up our treatments and whether something works. And, we're familiar with the good research designs and, our systematic literature reviews being the gold standard evidence that we look for. So to talk about the placebo effect, which is very difficult to visualize and see objectively, in ways, I suppose people, I sensed that people feel almost like it's a dirty word that we were doing. We were kind of tricking people if we used the placebo effect. But I believe, and from what I've read, and again, this Expectation Effect book has some reference to it, that the public, people in general now, know an awful lot more about placebo effect. Last night I gave a talk in a public library about my book, and at one stage I asked people, just how many people have heard of the placebo effect? And I would say 60% of the people there had very enthusiastically heard of the placebo effect and knew that it was a positive thing. And from what I read in the research, this is leading to a little bit of a problem with the generation of new medicines nowadays. Because traditionally, the last hurdle for creating new medicines is to do your randomized trials where you compare the new medicine against a placebo medicine. But what they're finding now is that the placebo arms of those trials, because people know more about placebos and because they have a positive belief and they kind of feel more comfortable with them, people in that placebo trial are doing even better than they ever did before, which now means that the new drugs that are being created, they have to do substantially better to be a certain amount above that. And it's almost making that very difficult for drug companies to get new drugs across the market, across the line.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just like clarify that a bit further. So we have traditionally studies that we're running, like currently, and those, 10, 20, 50 years ago, you would have a natural outcome. So you would hold, so somebody wouldn't get the actual treatment. They would think that they were getting the actual treatment. And then what would happen is that that placebo arm would actually do pretty well. And so the differences between, the new introduction, the new treatment, the pharmaceutical treatment, but it's not just pharmaceutical. It can be other types of interventions that are non-pharmaceutical as well. They still have a placebo arm. So what we saw was that the difference between the two groups was very minor, and it has to be of certain magnitude in order for you to make, for example, marketing claims, and also for you to make, to make good business case, like to bring something to market. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that you're saying here is that because people are starting to believe more generally, not necessarily in the placebo effect, but maybe they're starting to adopt more generally like happier thoughts, or they're starting to like adopt ways of thinking that would reinforce the the efficiency or the efficacy of that placebo effect, right? Because it's not that you don't just know about the placebo effect and then it works better. That's not what you're saying. You're saying that generally people are, they're embracing thoughts that would, facilitate even further the efficacy of a placebo effect.
And what's very important, I suppose, here is that regardless of what a placebo effect is or does or is believed, we can enhance any treatment, be it a physiotherapy treatment or a medical treatment or a surgery or anything, by simply telling people about how the treatment is going to work and making them understand better before they get it. Yeah. And that kind of primes the brain in a way that helps and uses that placebo effect. And you're still getting the same treatment. So it's not like we're withholding treatments from them. All we're doing is we're enhancing what we always did to improve the outcomes. And from what I'm reading, the expectation effect research articles, I see that this is probably the way forward in medicine.
I could imagine at some point, though, it does sort of balance the ethical lines in a different, like it crosses the ethical boundaries in a different way than we perceived. Because usually you would give statistics to say like your probability of recovery is X, right? And you would have to give that because you have, like if someone was coming in for like cancer treatment or any other type of intervention that has inherent risk in it, then it is the obligation of, the caregiver or the, to provide the risks associated with that. But now you're sort of in a position where, well, I can say that these are the statistics, and the statistics actually may not sound very optimistic when you deliver them. But then how do professionals now go about and say, well, those are the statistics. But if you want to push out the placebo effect, then you kind of have to override statistics. So you have to go from giving an informed decision and then saying, okay, I've given that informed decision, but now how do I, as, someone that really cares about their patients and their success, how do I then override that and make sure that I get the most out of the placebo effect? Have you ever struggled with that internally, or do you see that now as a bit problematic? We have to give informed consent, or well, you need, yeah.
I suppose the starting point for all of clinicians and healthcare professionals is evidence-based medicine. So we're expecting, a patient should expect that anybody that's giving them advice knows what the up-to-date evidence is. And of course, that's very difficult sometimes because of the weight of evidence. But we now have systematic literature reviews, which are fantastic, the gold standard of evidence. And but what I'm doing for patients then is I'm enhancing that information by the way that I speak to them beforehand. and by the way that I describe that. And I consciously spend more time before we do our treatments with patients to really ensure that they get the most from that part of the explanation. And I think that's, we've always had excellent doctors and excellent therapists who, explained things, sat down beside a patient and did this, because it was part of their training, but they may not have done it on a formal basis. But what I'm suggesting is that I think it'll become part of curricula much more. It'll be the advice that, this is done. This is something that probably should be mandatory to be done. And it mightn't be even me saying to you, Shellie, as your physiotherapist. I may say, look, when you leave the clinic tonight, you go home and I want you to look at this video. And that video is something I may have produced or maybe generically produced. And it talks about the evidence, and it may talk about all the pluses and minuses. But for the most part, I wouldn't be recommending something because I wouldn't be recommending something for you to do unless I felt that the overall was plus, it was something that could benefit you.
Right. And that's where you can, start to gain the trust, because there's also a moment in your book where you talk about how that physiotherapists, for example, or other types of caregivers, that they are conduits for delivering care, but delivering, incentivizing, motivating, gaining trust. But you also say that because they are working as a conduit, and I know conduit is probably my own interpretation of how you phrased it, but you also say that it's really about the caregiver as an individual and not necessarily about the different forms of treatment. So here, what you have just said is like, well, if I recommend this specific approach for you, it's because I believe that it will work for you. And thereby you're gaining, you're utilizing whatever you can pull out of that placebo effect, also knowing deep down that there's probably potentially more than one treatment approach that could help this individual. And this is the one that you chose for them because you think it's the best. Would that be a fair interpretation of some of the points?
I suppose there's two things that are interesting what you just said. First of all, when it comes to being involved in treatments, it's now widely known and accepted that if a patient can become actively involved in their treatment process, however that active is involved, they tend to do much better in outcomes because they feel there's a sense of control. Again, there's a very interesting experiment by a psychologist in Duke University, and it was to do with asking people what type of beers that they wanted in a bar. And essentially, when he went to a table of 4 people and he publicly asked everybody he gave them a choice of 4 beers. And when he mentioned it publicly where everybody could hear which beer the other one was choosing, they find that individuals try to show their individuality by choosing something different. So it's very likely that people will choose a different beer because they want to show their individuality. However, when he gave a piece of paper with the 4 beers on it to people where they secretly could choose which one they wanted, people chose mostly what they really wanted. And so most people were choosing the same beers. When they evaluated who was the happiest after their choices, they find that by far the people who chose the ones they really wanted, so in secret, they were much, much happier with their choice. So we choose publicly, we choose because we want to show individuality, but we're not happy with that. Whereas when we choose exactly what we want, we're much happier. And the reason I mention that is that when patients have the opportunity to be involved in their treatment and feel like they can choose what's appropriate for them, which I well believe is very possible with patients, because in the world of physiotherapy, in the world of stroke rehabilitation, there are probably about 30 different treatments that are available that are safe. There's evidence to say that they do good, but there's no one golden ticket treatment that's out there that everybody's looking for. And this is a belief. People are searching for this, but there is no one, but there are 30 that are definitely can benefit you. And you see, patients need to be explained that to have the confidence to try a number of these. And they will instinctively know which ones suit them best. I hear this back from patients all the time, but medicine traditionally has been a little bit passive, from my opinion, that patients have waited for doctors and therapists to kind of say, here's what you do, and then you do it. But what we're probably going to see, and again, I would advocate this, is that we give people safe therapies that can have the potential to benefit them, and let the people decide from those which are the ones they feel works best for them. And then we introduce that element of control and deciding what you're going to do. And the outcomes, in my opinion, should be much better, and people feel more in control. And I think that's where the second thing you mentioned was the caregivers. Caregivers can have this role with their stroke survivors because caregivers have the ability to explain things, which is a huge, a kind of essential skill that they possess, and they don't realize it. Patients, caregivers can facilitate simple exercise programs done safely in their own homes if they have the guidance for that, and if they know the background that we're letting patients decide what they like to do, and we'll facilitate that, then they can play a huge role in that decision making process.
Right. So it's quite interesting that we went from, ordering beers at a restaurant to like choosing like a menu of potential treatment options. And I think that's quite nice because maybe people like to see themselves or imagine themselves following a treatment approach that does actually match their personality, that potentially matches better their own belief system, which we have already highlighted how important that is. But I also couldn't help but think like, when you're with your family and, you have young kids and you want to take a choice. I never really realized like how interesting and how aware we should be as parents, even as, when you want to allow your kids to take their individual choices. So let them choose from the menu. They don't have to tell you what it is. Like I've been to restaurants where, you have a piece of paper, and then you like check off the things that you want. And as you were telling that story, I was like, I was thinking a lot of those restaurants that have been successful, tend to also be family restaurants, and they tend to have this piece of paper. And I'm wondering if that's why everybody's so happy at those restaurants when they take their family there, because the kids got to choose what they really wanted. I know it's a big jump from going from like eating out to choosing, your rehabilitation protocol. But if it is an underlying truth, if it is a principle, then it should transcend all sorts of disciplines and all sorts of facets of life. So I think it's a fantastic story with the beer. I love it. It's spot on.
But one thing that I suppose I want to just to say to people is that the area that I'm very interested in is stroke rehabilitation, neurology rehabilitation. And in that particular discipline, there are at least 30 different therapies that are out there that people can do that are safe and that have evidence behind them, which is a very difficult thing for patients because again, apparently, back to your children, Shellie, apparently if you give your children a choice of 6 ice creams to choose from, or you give them a choice of 24 ice creams to choose from, apparently they'll be much happier with their choice if you give them 6. So for that reason, people like myself, it's inherent on us probably to suggest to people a starting point of a small number of therapies. And again, in my book, I limit that to 6 particular therapies that I think, because suggesting all 30 becomes very difficult, to do that. So I think if you start with 6 and you kind of, actively try those things and decide which work, because I had a very interesting experience with a stroke patient a number of years ago where, the Wii games, the Sony Wii that you play in front of the television where you hold a handset and you can control the games.
Yeah, they were really popular for quite some time. Yeah.
Yeah, when they came out at the start, I was working with a patient in his own home, one of the first people that really inspired me. And I became aware that there was a board as well that you could stand on, a wee board where you kind of stood, and when you balance, it was good for your balance, and also you controlled a ball going into a hole, I think a golf ball. And when I saw this, I thought to myself, this is going to be perfect for this stroke patient. And by pure coincidence, one of his neighbour's children had that particular device. So we arranged a few days later to get it. And I was so excited, I have to say. I thought this is going to be fantastic. And when we went in and we got Frank onto the board and the whole palaver, and we were all excited, and he stood up on it, he hated it with a passion. He hated it. He just, whatever happened inside him within seconds, it was like, get me off this, get me away. And he wanted me to throw out the thing out the window almost, you know? So it was a very good reminder that what I think can work for people isn't always going to be the case. So people need to trial different therapies. And again, and they kind of decide and they get an instinctive feeling what's good for them. And just to know that you can become active in your treatments and that you should, that's important for people to understand.
Yeah, and that you should. I think that's a key element here, that you can't just externalize the responsibility onto somebody else. People do need to take more proactive decisions into how they want to manage their recovery. I would like to just briefly talk a bit about like what is stroke, and because I think some people that are listening maybe get confused sometimes between, what is a stroke and what is a heart attack, for example. So could you just briefly describe like what a stroke is, and then would you be willing to share your understanding of which areas, like which locations that a stroke can occur that are particularly, having a harder or maybe a more longer journey in rehabilitation?
Yeah, so I suppose people who are having a stroke usually experience the acronym for how you recognize a stroke is FAST. So it kind of stands for people noticing that they feel a little bit dizzy, they feel like they have a headache. This is something that happens to them, it can happen instantaneously. Maybe they feel that their speech certainly starts to be a bit slurred. They don't seem to be able to move. Perhaps they might notice a little bit of weakness in their arms. Their balance may be a little bit delayed. And so that those symptoms sometimes suggest that there's something that could be related to a stroke. Stroke could be happening if you find those things. And usually if you recognize that in somebody, a friend or a relation of yours or a relative, then maybe it's time to call the 999 or whatever the number 911 for yourselves.
Emergency.
If they go to hospital, usually they will do little scans that can show whether or not the person has actually had a bleed or a blockage into an artery in their brain. So a stroke essentially is that one of the major arteries in your brain has been deprived of oxygen, and that 85% of people who have that, it's usually because of a little clot that blocks the artery, and so that area of the brain is damaged because it's deprived of oxygen. And in 10 to 15% of people, they have a vessel that bursts or ruptures, and you often hear that called a subarachnoid hemorrhage, and that then the blood being around brain tissue, it causes it to be deprived of oxygen and it gets damaged as well. So those images are kind of done, and usually these symptoms will last for more than 24 hours usually, which is kind of probably the definition that you would.
So you can like be in a stroke for 24 hours almost.
Well, I think again, I'm not a medical doctor, but it's people get symptoms of a little bit dizziness and headaches, and it can kind of last a short while and be gone. So I suppose we don't want to startle everybody who gets those symptoms, because otherwise everybody's showing up in the emergency department. But where those symptoms are lasting for up to 24 hours, and then the signs of the facial weakness and the slurring of speech and that, then we're definitely thinking this is definitely should be investigated. And then when it's investigated, they can find out whether or not it's a blockage or if it's a bleed that's causing thing, because nowadays patients can be given clot busting medicines that can be very, very beneficial for them if they're given within a certain length of time. But of course, we don't want to give those to somebody who has
that's like a blood thinner, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
In terms of which are the best or the worst strokes to get, I
If you
suppose
could
it's
choose.
well, the main
Yeah.
areas that get damaged, I suppose, the frontal area of your brain, the motor cortex area, or the speech area is what's known as the Broca's area, where speech can be affected. And then there's in your temporal lobe, you have this Wernicke's area that can be damaged. And we see, from balance point of view, if your cerebellum is damaged, then your balance can be affected as a result of that, and your coordination. And of course, probably a stroke or like that affects your brain stem is probably going to be a very life-threatening
Yeah, that would be
situation,
the worst. Yeah.
because that's really your control area of the brain, and occipital areas that control your vision can be damaged as well. So I suppose all of those things can be very serious, and the symptoms can go on. Broadly speaking, uh, when patients get a stroke or diagnosed definitely with a stroke, the statistics would say that a third of those people will get a full recovery. A third of those people approximately will actually die because of the stroke, and then a third will be left with the physical and the cognitive and the speech, the emotional, the sensory, those kind of deficits, and the things that I am very interested in helping people with, and therapists like myself, to try and help them recover. And that recovery can happen very quickly, and it can happen over a long period of time. But usually we need to prepare people for the idea that recovery kind of can take a long period of time, and that's where we need to kind of help
What
people
is
motivate.
long in your frame of mind?
Well, when I started as a therapist 30 years ago, we were told that patients would, within 6 months, 6 to 9 months, that was really the time frame for getting full recovery, or the best recovery, or the best rebuild for themselves. But we know now, so patients, that goes into 12 months, 24 months. That's not unusual. So a lot of people need to prepare themselves that that's the length of time that you're going to have to be doing, positive exercise programs and positive therapies, and not be getting themselves disappointed and creating that negative mindset, because it hasn't all happened in a very short space of time. So,
And what is the age span typically for people that have experienced a stroke, like their first stroke, for example?
I don't know the exact statistics on age, but the majority of people will still be, above 60 years of age. So they'll be mostly older people.
Mm-hmm.
However, anecdotally, I've seen much more younger people in my clinics over the last 10 years, much more younger people.
Like younger, as in like 50 or even 40 years of age?
Yeah, and even younger.
Even younger.
Yeah,
Okay.
you can see people like not so long ago in my local town, a very high profile Gaelic footballer. We play Gaelic football here. Young person in his 20s had a stroke, and I think he made a very good recovery. But it just shows you that young people.
Yeah, it can happen, but it's more rare, obviously,
It
which
is.
would also imply that stroke is something like it is in some way associated with aging and the mechanisms that drive aging. But it could also be associated with lifestyle. So the accumulated effects of the choices that we're making daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. Um, are you aware of any? Are you aware of the research that is pointing towards one thing or another for associations that potentially increase the risk of stroke as we go throughout our lives?
Yes, this is very interesting to me, and it's relevant to me because I teach in a university in the northwest of Ireland, so it's the Atlantic Technological University, and the courses that I teach are related to health science, and a number of the
Related
modules,
to, sorry,
health science.
health science. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
health science. So, how to be healthy and fit. And we discuss an awful lot about the importance of moderate intensity exercise. I don't know if you've heard of moderate intensity exercise, but essentially, the World Health Organization recommends that everybody, yourself included, Shellie, to give yourself the best chance of not developing chronic illness. So chronic illness is stroke, cardiovascular problems, heart attacks, osteoporosis, arthritis, all of those things, diabetes, obesity, to give yourself the best chance of not developing those, then you should be going each week for 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise, which for most people is a walk. And you go with your husband or you go with your friend, and it's where you could walk with somebody and you could talk to them comfortably, but you couldn't sing to them, because if you tried singing, you'd be out of breath. And
Right.
that type of exercise, and especially walking, that's an exercise and that people underestimate the benefit of, because most
And
people, from my experience, like to try and be very active, and a lot of people, younger people especially, they try to unless they're sweating their heads off after an exercise session, it's not good. And then the other thing for yourself that you should ideally be doing is maybe 2 sessions a week of resistance exercises of some form. And those could be just body weight exercises where you do some press ups and maybe some sit ups and some little core exercises. And if you do those things, then that's going to give you a huge chance of not developing those chronic illnesses. The other things that there's good research to say in general is, taking 5 portions of fruit and vegetables every day if you can, hydrating your body with plenty of water, keeping yourself busy, funnily enough, seems to be a very important thing to keep healthy in life. When I see patients in my clinic who, are in their 70s and 80s and they look 10 years younger, I'm always asking them, just saying, well, what's your secret? Tell us what your secret is. And of course, the first thing they say is they keep busy. Obviously not stressful busy, but keeping busy. And then they keep their minds active as well. So they read newspapers or they do crosswords and things. And then getting sleep and getting that deep sleep, that restorative sleep that we need. That's very, very important, because the biggest risk factor for strokes is, sedentary behavior. So not doing exercise, not doing regular physical activity, allowing your blood pressure perhaps to build up. High blood pressure is a very big risk factor for developing strokes. And, the other risk factors will be, having a poor diet, smoking, excess alcohol. And again, and we never think of it, but watching TV is actually one of the worst. Watching TV over a prolonged period of time can be almost one of the biggest risk factors that we have in society, funnily enough, because it leads to such sedentary behavior. And we see it now with kids, don't we? They're on their phones all the time, sitting down sometimes in front of computers, playing games.
oh, that's interesting. I don't think people really make those connections. Like, you don't think about like how often we're sitting and scrolling, or, binge watching a show on the weekend. That is actually, yeah, increasing our risks for future illness. It's not saying that you're going to get it, but it's definitely puts you on a tangent where you're increasing the odds of suffering from something that you could have potentially avoided. And I think that's what many of us don't realize.
It's not a guarantee. It's not an absolute guarantee, but like I'm always explaining to the students, I'm saying, if you take 1,000 people who do all those good things and 1,000 who don't, the chances are going to be far, 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 far higher in the people who don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And which group do you want to be in, right? So, like, you have to decide.
In the
end,
what would help our health system here overnight, Shellie, and this is my personal opinion, but there's lots of evidence to back this up. If we could get everybody in Ireland in the next month going out for a 30-minute walk 5 days a week, we would actually, our health system would be saved overnight. Simple as that. Because walking is such a powerful thing, and it's such an underestimated thing. An awful lot of new research about walking. There's a very good book, by the way, just for your listeners, by a professor in Trinity College in Dublin. He's called Shane O'Mara, and he's written a fabulous book called In Praise of Walking. In Praise of Walking. And it's such an easy read, but it's brilliant. But one of the things that's fabulous that they've discovered in the last number of years about walking is that when we walk for 30 to 40 minutes, our bodies produce these growth factors, or these important chemicals that seem to strengthen our brain cells and strengthen our body in general. And they've only discovered this in the last 5 or 10 years. So, I'm saying to my patients that, if you go for a 30-minute walk, you really are probably increasing your chances of decreasing your chances of getting Alzheimer's and dementia.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, so now that we see the associations with, the, the reduction in risks associated with moderate intensity exercise. One of those, which is the most easiest for us to do, is to go out for a walk. And what is it about the walk that is helpful, right? So is it because you're looking at trees, you're hearing the birds sing? I mean, that might be nice too, but as you're saying here, very new research is coming out, and that research is showing that it is creating some, you call them nerve growth hormones, right? So can you explain like what exactly is that for some naive listeners that might not understand the connection?
Well, first of all, walking, I mean, everybody instinctively knows that a walk bestows, good things in your body or in you,
Yeah,
because
it feels
we've
good,
all,
right? Like nobody regrets going for a walk. Like I've rarely met someone that said, "Oh, that walk was horrible." Like,
we do, because sometimes it's hard for us to get started. Personally, the reason why people don't go for a lot of walks is because it doesn't cost anything. And you'll say that's a silly thing to say, but in life, a lot of people sometimes need to pay. We undervalue things that are for free. And of course, to go for a walk, all you need is a pair of walking shoes, a pair of runners, and a good jacket, depending on the weather. And then you can go and walk, outside your door. And it's a very good thing to do. So instinctively, we know that when we go for the walk and come back, we feel great for the rest of the day. And one of the, so it's good for our mental health. We burn calories when we go. So it's a weight loss program.
Yes.
We strengthen our bodies. We release a little bit of extra testosterone in our bodies when we go for a walk. So, that's a rebuilding hormone that we create. And what these growth factors or growth chemicals that Professor Shane O'Mara mentions are just an extension, I suppose, of, it's just that they realize these rebuilding hormones that are released that seem to be able to strengthen our bodies. Apparently, his explanation is interesting. It's that apparently hundreds of years ago, when people went for extensive walks, it was for two reasons. One was that it was to either get away from danger, or it was because foodstuffs ran out and they had to go to find new foodstuffs. So tribes that would walk long distances. And apparently those ones who produced this important hormones, that kind of helped you to kind of, fight off and, be able to kind of protect yourself a bit more, they lasted longer. And that still happens in society nowadays. So it's just to the awareness for people that this is happening, in addition to all the other things that we always knew. And it's just to kind of say to people, look, don't underestimate how good a walk is. Funnily enough, I was listening yesterday to a podcast, and the podcast was called Exploring Health by a man called Parker Condit. And it was so funny, but the last part of the podcast with a guest, they talked about walking, and it was everything I've just said to you. It was like he was saying, walking is the ultimate exercise that we need to introduce for ourselves, because he was comparing it to running that people like to do. And he was just saying that sometimes if you're running, people pick up injuries, and when they pick up injuries, then they stop doing the running and the exercise. Whereas you're never really going to get that with walking. So a lot in life is building up habits. And you see, walking really fits with habits, because it's very rare that we would be not able to go for our walk. We definitely wouldn't be getting injured usually. So there's my big tip for the day, Shellie, is we need to get every person out walking.
Get them out walking. But this also makes sense too, like when people are going on holidays and vacations, and sometimes, like especially for work, when I would travel for conferences, I would sometimes I like to stay at the conference hotel because everything is so convenient. But this is actually a perfect opportunity to like get your hotel 20-minute walking distance away from like the place that you're going to, so that you ensure that you get that 20-minute morning walk, 20-minute post-conference walk into your regimen. But this is also just for like anyone that is traveling for work, where you're sort of out of your routine. You don't always have to book your hotel like exactly where you need to go. You can make sure you get that walk in. So just us, like just small choices like that. We have a dog, so my husband and I, we were walkers, if that's a correct term. We were walkers a long time ago, and we had actually decided that we could handle getting a dog because we liked to go for walks. So that was like our decision on, why we ended up, you know, when someone asks you, like, can you handle getting a dog? It's a big responsibility. And we're like, well, we already go for lots of walks. And it's so true. So this may also explain too, like why a lot of research supports that, as people age, those that have a dog or other types of pets that keep them somewhat active, that they probably fare better in terms of rehab or recovery or even preventative. And one part of that research also focused on the social aspects as well. So walking alone is good, but also walking with a friend could potentially even double the effects of the walk itself. Would you care to comment on the social interaction?
Everything you said is exactly what research is showing. My first year students in the health science courses, on their first day, I showed them a video. It's a YouTube video. It's called 23 and a half hours. And I forget the name of the man that does it. But essentially it's, can you not fit in 30 minutes of physical activity? And he talks exactly, one of the things, he talks about the benefits of moderate intensity exercise, walking. And yeah, walking, having a dog, apparently 67% of dog owners meet the criteria for, healthy lives. If you want to, for your listeners, if they want a humorous side of this, I mention a man called Chuck McCarthy in my book. He is a brilliant TED talker, but Chuck McCarthy has a company called People Walker Incorporated, and Chuck is a people walker. So he decided,
so clever.
he decided that there's people out there who actually would pay to have somebody accompany them for a walk. I think it's in New York or somewhere like that he is. But he said people were laughing at the start, but they're not laughing now. He's a good company built up, because sometimes we like a buddy or somebody to go, and even having a buddy to talk with, or if I was trying to make sure I didn't miss my walk, if I pair up with a friend or a colleague, I'm less likely to kind of cancel on them as I might be if it was just myself. So sometimes just those habits is good. And what you said there is very important, that when you were out for a walk, it's not just the person you're with that you socialize with. Normally we bump into friends, we bump into neighbors, and I love Malcolm Gladwell, who's written fantastic books.
Oh, he's amazing. Yeah, he is. Absolutely.
And one of his books, Outliers, has a chapter called the Rossetto Effect. Mm-hmm. And the Rossetto Effect is essentially discussing, groups of people around the world that, seem to be very healthy, get very little cardiovascular disease. And of course, the discussion is, what is it that they're doing that makes them? And they looked at diet, and they looked at exercise, they looked at all of those things, but they didn't correlate those things. What they correlated was it's community involvement. Those people in those areas, it's like an open door policy in their houses. People come around, they visit, they sit down, they chat, and it's very much that kind of a lifestyle. And of course, most people's lifestyles are going completely the opposite way nowadays. We're not getting out talking to people. We're not meeting people because we're in our houses. We're looking on phones and looking on social media. So just getting out there, the walk is brilliant, but the social interaction is also just as important.
Yeah, we actually had a guest on Bonded by Science who is into soft robotics, and he's developing lower limb soft robotics to facilitate walking as we get older. So like to keep people outdoors, to keep them hiking, to keep them, it could also be because they've had some form of injury where they don't have necessarily the muscle mass to really get that nice long walk in. But as we talked about, when you go for a walk, there is a mechanism, like it's releasing these hormones that could potentially, help us build more muscle, helps us build more, neuronal connections, keeps things alive essentially in our body. And so you want to move your whole body. And I think walking is pretty close to like a full body movement. I mean, if you get, you're engaging your core, you're engaging your large muscles, You have the balance. So, and especially if you're going on somewhat uneven terrain, then you're really also engaging your control, like really control mechanisms that are in place. So yeah, so I think, you know, we were talking about like how do we, because he's been developing this also at the university with his lab and his PhD students, and it's gotten really far. And we were talking about like, well, what's the next step? And he was like, well, I've laid out all the foundation. You know, I've showed that the tech can work. I've showed that it can help people walk further. Um, and he's like, but it's not, now it's up to somebody else to come and like absorb that technology and bring it out into society. So I think it'll be really interesting, you know, as years go by, that people start to understand like some of the best medicine is just, it's just outside your front door.